Welcome everybody, and thank you again for joining us today for our Backup Withholding webinar. I am Lauren Skinner-Johnson with Convey Compliance, and I will be your moderator. Before we start the program, I'd like to cover a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, to facilitate efficiency and respect everyone's time, all participants will be on mute for the duration of the event. So if you have a question during the presentation, please type it in the Q&A or the chat box in the panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And we will review all of those questions and respond to as many as we can during the Q&A session, which will be at the end of the webinar. Also, Convey hosts an annual tax and regulatory conference called the C2 Summit. And this year's C2 Summit will be held at the Omni Shore Motel in Washington, D.C., Wednesday, September 28th through Friday, September 30th. It's coming up very quickly. And for attending today's webinar, we'd like to offer you a discount of $100 off of your registration. You'll see the discount code at the bottom of the screen, and the discount code is case sensitive. The C2 Summit is a live tax information reporting seminar that includes about 2.5 days of regulatory compliance and Convey solution sessions. For additional information, or if you'd like to register, please visit c2summit.convey.com. Now I'd like to introduce Jeff Cronin, Vice President of Product Strategy for Convey Compliance. Jeff is going to walk us through a high-level overview of the backup withholding process and what's new to the process in 2011. But before I hand it over to Jeff, I'd like to get a better understanding of how backup withholding affects your organization by opening this polling question. The question is, how large of an issue is backup withholding to your organization? A, not an issue, B, somewhat of an issue, C, a very large issue, or D, I don't know. We'll just give you a quick minute to answer that question. All right, thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff.
Thank you, Lauren. The poll results show that for the majority of you, this is something of an issue. It's not a substantial issue, and actually, it's actually a relatively small number of you answered I don't know, which is good to see. Today, we're going to cover a couple of topics. Obviously, backup withholding is the focus here, but we're going to start off speaking a little bit about federal withholding, and then we're going to spend some time talking through the state withholding process and which regulations and rules you should pay attention to at the state level, and then a little bit of question and answer at the end. It's worth noting at the beginning, I'll give you in the legal notice section, I'll give you the plain English version. Any information we provide here is for guidance and informational purposes only. If you want to have any specific guidance or you want to discuss this or take any action, you should probably discuss it with your internal tax attorney or your tax advisor. So to start with, the preferential position for us all to be in is to not have to do backup withholding at all. The vast majority of what we're working on as an industry is we spend time speaking about the B notice process, and we spend time talking about 1441 withholding for non-resident aliens, for those of us who like to get detailed. And all of those procedures are essentially reactive. They put us in a position where we have to respond to the IRS's requirement for us to withhold on payments. Obviously, if it's possible, we would really like to avoid any kind of reactive process and focus on a proactive process that verifies that the information you have on a recipient or someone who you're making a payment to is correct up front prior to initiating your first payment, matches that information against the IRS database to verify that that person is, in fact, providing you with a valid name and TIN so that you can avoid any of the withholding situation at all. This is a timely topic because actually if you look at the timeline, in October, actually we were told, I guess it was just this week, people started receiving their first CP2100s, which is the B notice notification in the mail for the January filed 1099s. The process for those of you who've received your CP2100 will kick off, and in many cases you will find yourself required to do backup withholding. And typically that requirement starts within 30 days of receiving that CP2100 in the mail if you have not corrected that documentation for that individual. And then in August of the following year for the tax year 2010 filings, you'll receive your penalty notices and respond to them as necessary. So first, let's spend a moment talking about what B notices are. And so B notices are a notification that you have provided the IRS with missing or incorrect name and taxpayer identification numbers. Those notifications, if they're incorrect, are sent back to you under a B notice, and they're only reviewed for those form types that are subject to backup withholding. So some examples for backup withholding forms are the 1099-B, the 1099 div, the INT interest statement, miscellaneous income, original issue discount, W-2G for gambling winnings, and brand new for this year is 1099-K. So the form 1099-K, there's a separate webinar and topic on our website discussing what 1099-K is. It's going to be listed under section, it's the 6050W rules, and it applies to payment intermediaries or merchant acquiring banks. Basically, if you actually settle credit card payments for someone, or you're a third-party payment entity and moving funds on behalf of a third party, you could be subject to 1099-K reporting. You receive from the IRS, and we are just starting to receive them now, CP2100 or CP2100A. That's the technical name of the file. If you have over 250 B notices, you will receive that electronically. If you have 15 B notices to receive, they will send it to you on paper. In both cases, these are going to be based on your prior year transmittal. So right now, you're receiving your CP2100 for tax year 2010. When you receive that, you have to track whether or not you're on the first or second notice. Now, the important thing to keep in mind here is that the IRS doesn't track this for you. On a first B notice, you are going to actually have to solicit for information and ask for a corrected tax identity, and then get back on verifying that the tax identity is, that the person's individual tax identity is correct. And then the other thing you need to track is whether or not you're subject to the 2- and 3-year rule. What that means is you're on a first B notice if you have actually been given 2 mailings within 3 calendar years. So you need, and that if in the situation where you're actually on a second notice, you need to send a different solicitation package, a different package out to correct the information than if you were on the first notice. The IRS will not track this for you. They just send you a list of those records that are under a B notice. They don't tell you this is a first notice and a second notice. That's your responsibility. So now what? You have a first B notice. When you're in a first B notice condition, all this leads up to whether or not you're subject to back withholding. So you're in a first notice. Did you get one? Did you actually send a W-9 out and get it back within 30 days? If the answer is yes, you can count it as good. There's no backup withholding. If you did not receive a W-9 back from your recipient within the first 30 business days, you immediately have to begin backup withholding, or within 30 business days. On a second B notice, if you didn't get it back within 30 days, then yes, you have to update your records and with a certified name and TIN. If you don't, you again begin backup withholding. the question you almost immediately get on the federal side then is, if I have to withhold, how do I send the money? Where does that money go? And the first question is to understand what your payment frequency is. So if you're a financial services institution and you are, if I'm a bank and I'm regularly doing a substantial amount of backup withholding, then I will already likely know how frequently I have to send the Department of Treasury my funds for backup withholding. But frankly, for a lot of people who don't spend a lot of time doing this, they may not know what their current payment cycle and payment frequency is. Is it quarterly? Is it monthly? Is it semi-weekly or daily? And so you need to not only know what your default payment frequency is, but you need to develop a process internally to actually accelerate your payment cycle if you exceed $100,000 in outstanding withholding to the IRS at any given time, because then you actually move into a daily payment frequency. Knowing how to move in and out of how to change your payment frequency dynamically based on the outstanding withholding amounts is important. And on top of that, you have to get your reporting in order. So you not only have 1099 reporting, but then you will have the withholding reporting to complete. And when you file that withholding reporting and reconciliation with the Internal Revenue Service, you need to know, based on your payment frequency, which forms to file when. And all of that needs to be handled somehow. And I would guess, honestly, most frequently that would be handled by most organizations we speak to on an Excel spreadsheet internally in the tax department somewhere. If you're doing it on an Excel spreadsheet, that pretty much means that you're unfortunately state of the art. There are other solutions for this, but typically you're going to have to acquire something. For 2011, there's 4 form types. The 1039, 21, and 22 we haven't talked about. Those are for employee stock purchase and employee stock option plans. If you have a stock purchase or stock option plan in place today that is maintained by you, that is administered by you as an organization, you need to go look into how you're handling the tax reporting on those form types and whether or not there is an additional withholding responsibility you'll have. And it's worth noting that the IRS is increasing penalties across the board. What is penalized by the IRS? Records that are filed with a missing or incorrect TIN. Most frequently that comes by, especially if you're paying a vendor, for example, you'll see that most frequently in situations where that vendor actually is doing business under a different name than they're legally structured to operate under. So you look at any number of organizations that actually function under an operating name. What's a good example of one? If I buy from Exxon, Exxon may not actually be operating under Exxon, but they're Exxon Oil Company, Inc., and unfortunately, Exxon Oil needs to be listed separately. The penalties for late returns, so if you file late or for the wrong media formats. The time of filing penalties are actually pretty substantial. So if you file late, 30 days or less late, it's $30 per occurrence. Before August 1st is $60 per occurrence. After August 1st is $100. And then intentional disregard. If you do not file intentionally, the penalty is $250 per event. But most importantly, there is no limit to how much your fine can be relating to that. I want to spend a moment talking about an area that is really pretty confusing for just about everybody, frankly. About 2.5 years ago, the state of California passed a mandatory backup withholding rule. The law, as it was originally written, was frankly pretty vague. The way it has worked out in the end is that in the state of California, all of the state laws have fallen into 2 categories. One, you're really talking about backup withholding on non-wage income, on traditional income that would be reported normally on a 1099 miscellaneous. And for sake of conversation, I'm ignoring the backup withholding rules, or actually the withholding rules, not necessarily backup withholding, the withholding rules on retirement accounts, because frankly, there are 41 jurisdictions that we're tracking on the 1099-R withholding regulations. And if you're a organization that is managing retirement accounts and issuing Form 1099-R, the withholding rules are something you should be pretty familiar with, or we should be doing it. We'll do a separate webinar if there's enough interest, just to talk about 1099-R withholding. Here we're focused on backup withholding, specifically when you end up in a situation where you have TIN name mismatch and fall into the backup withholding regulations as opposed to under the normal withholding regulations. And so it really, the states sort of fell into two buckets. One, I'm going to require backup withholding on the 1099 miscellaneous. Two, I'm going to have a more broad-based backup withholding regime that covers more income types. So, for example, in California, there's a backup withholding rate of 7% of the payment made to an individual, either for California-sourced income or for California residents, only if that individual is subject to federal backup withholding. Colorado is 4.63%, Georgia is 6%, Minnesota 7.85%, and South Carolina is 7%. Now, obviously, those numbers all can change based on conditions, but that's the general rules here. In a lot of these cases, you're dealing with just 1099 miscellaneous reportable income, and not, Colorado, for example, Colorado, the law is written in such a way that there was a lot of confusion among some of our customers as to whether or not all income was subject to backup withholding, or it was only income that was otherwise reportable on the 1099 miscellaneous form. And the clarification we have from the state of Colorado was that no, in fact, it is only going to be covering 1099 miscellaneous income. The broad-based side, you have Maine. And in Maine, it's 5% of any payment made if federal tax is withheld on that payment. Vermont, it's 27% of the federal tax withheld on any payment made if federal tax was withheld on that payment. And which is an interesting calculation challenge for Vermont, I would guess, in order to get the reconciliation right, because they have to determine what your federal withholding was and then calculate 27% of that about what you should have withheld for them. And then in Kansas, it's 5% of the amount paid, but Kansas excludes interest and dividend payments as not being taxable in Kansas. So you do not withhold on interest and dividends only but you do withhold on every other income type in Kansas if there's federal withholding included. The point here is that standard withholding still applies. So if you're responsible to withhold, not backup withhold, but do normal withholding on a payment to an individual under W-2 regulations, this is not for you. This is not the point of this conversation. The point of this conversation is if you are withholding because you're under backup withholding regulations at the federal level, these states require you to do some kind of backup withholding in addition to that at the state level. So there are plenty of states that have their own withholding regulations as the primary withholding rules. In the state of Colorado and the city and county of Denver, you have city withholding requirements for wages. So this is not really meant. We're not addressing those. You still have to follow those rules. You still have to pay attention to those rules. But in the state of Colorado, under the backup withholding rules, if my income did not come from work, from 1099 miscellaneous reportable income for services provided, or from wage income under a W-2, then in Colorado I do not have to backup withhold for that payment. So remember that this is a backup withholding conversation, and you still have requirements on standard withholding. So you've now withheld money for the state. You have the same question at the state level that you had at the federal level. Unfortunately, it got more complicated because now you have to track 41 jurisdictions instead of 1. And if it's backup withholding, obviously it's only 7 if you're only subject to backup withholding. So what's your payment frequency at the state level? Again, that payment frequency can accelerate. You'll have a default remittance frequency to the State Department of Revenue that may be monthly, and that will change depending on how much you've paid so far this year. So you need a process to track the current payment cycle, how you're progressing, and whether or not you hit one of those state accelerators. You need to get your reporting in order because each state has its own reporting requirements. In California, there's an electronic transmittal that goes along with withholding remittance that needs to be handled somehow by your internal systems. You need to reconcile at least quarterly, but possibly even monthly or weekly, depending on the state you're filing in. You will also have some situations where you have to file multiple reconciliation reports with the state and self-report and self-correct any underpayment in the state level. So and you know, there's a note. I mentioned Department of Revenue. The individual state, I'm using that as a generic term. Obviously, in California is the Franchise Tax Board. Each state has their own regulatory agency to remit payments to. It's a detail with each state that you're working with as to whether or not that's the state you're dealing with. The same is true for reconciliation. So, and at the end of the year, when you file your 1099s, you'll need to reconcile your 1099 reporting information with your withholding remittance, the withholding payments that you made. So you're saying, here's my 1099 amount and how much I'm reporting I withheld. Here is my withholding reports and how much I said I withheld, and reconcile the two and correct any differences that may be involved. In many cases, you're responsible for calculating your own penalty, and if you've underpaid, and then actually remitting that penalty along with any difference in the funds to the regulatory agency at the time you make the report. So the reconciliation process at the state level looks a lot like the federal process, except obviously there are more states to reconcile or to handle reporting with, and it makes it more complicated. So I'd like to move into the question and answer section now.
And as we take a couple of minutes to just review some of the questions that we have received, I'd like to let everybody know that we have recorded this, and these slides will be available as well. So you will probably get an email from me in the next couple of days, again, with the recorded version of this webinar, as well as a PDF of the slides. And of course, if you have any questions or if you're interested in some more information about any of Convey's solutions that can help you streamline backup withholding and stay in compliance, you can always visit us at convey.com or call 1-888-303-1099. And with that, we're going to jump into the Q&A section. First question, Jeff, is, are IRS TIN matching responses sufficient to stop backup withholding from either a first or second B notice?
Sure. So this is a pretty common question. If I go and I actually go to the IRS website, type in the name and TIN that I have for somebody and verify that it's correct, that does not solve your B notice communication either on a first notice or second notice requirement, unfortunately. Once someone is under a B notice, you must send the prescribed documentation to the taxpayer and collect a response back or begin backup withholding, even if you do in fact know that the information you have is correct now. So in terms of doing a IRS TIN match and getting that information corrected, you really need to take that work on prior to receiving the B notice and actually really prior to actually filing with the IRS for that year. So that's really where you need to look at a proactive solution, where whatever process you're using to bring these either customers or vendors into your systems, that process includes verifying that the name and tax identity you have on file for that person is correct at the IRS, and some process to correct it if it's not, to avoid ending up subject to backup withholding.
Thank you. Next question. Can you verify that the 30-day withholding period is business days?
Yes, you have 30 business days before you have to begin backup withholding. So, and that will be true. I mean, frankly, if you've got no TIN on file today, you will probably want to consider initiating backup withholding immediately. Another thing that I commonly see people do is they have TINs on file that are all 9s, or they have that are what we would call transparently bad or transparently incorrect TINs, where you know that they didn't issue a 999 TIN, and so if you're operating with one of those in your internal systems where somebody stuck it in there just because you were required to have a number, you should be back withholding on that individual, that taxpayer immediately.
Thank you. Next question. Can you enter both the legal and doing business as name on the 1099?
No. The IRS, in the process of receiving and processing the 1099s, you can do that on the printed form, but the IRS transmittal will actually have electronically delivered to the Internal Revenue Service the name that's in the electronic 1099 or that will go in the 1099 form. Now that electronic transmittal, the IRS will actually verify the text that's in the name field with what they have on file for that taxpayer. If you include both the DBA and the legal name, that would not sufficiently identify, or the IRS would not identify that as a match to their internal systems. So a little trick for everybody. The IRS actually only validates the first 4 characters of the name field. They're not validating the whole string. So if you have the first 4 characters of the name right, the legal name right, it will come through as a positive match in the IRS website. So if you were wanting to do something like having the DBA and the official legal name, and the official legal name on the 1099 form, you could file the 1099 form as ABC Company doing business as ABC Shops Inc. And then the ABC Company would match properly to the IRS site, and you would get you would not get a B notice on that record.
Thank you. Next question. Do we have to issue some kind of 1099 to non-resident aliens?
So, I'm going to answer this question 2 ways. One is, am I a non-resident of the United States of America? And one, am I a non-resident of the state in which is requesting withholding? For non-resident aliens, by meaning that you actually are not a resident of the United States of America, I'm a UK citizen, they do not fall under a 1099 reporting obligation. They are required to be reported on something called a Form 1042-S. The Form 1042-S regulations are relatively complicated, and the documentation requirements to prove that that individual is in fact a foreign national and not a U.S. taxpayer incorrectly claiming foreign status for tax benefits is a subject for an entire webinar by itself. But on a quick and dirty answer, if you know and have documentation to prove that the individual you're paying is a foreign national, and you can verify the country of taxation for that individual, my example prior, I'm a UK citizen subject to UK tax code, then I would be subject to the 1042-S reporting rules. The 1042-S reporting rules have their own withholding requirements, substantially larger and more complicated than the withholding requirements for Form 1099. It has its own backup withholding rules, and there are a whole set of treaty rates negotiated depending on the country of taxation of the individual you're dealing with that can reduce the backup withholding rate by treaty. So, for example, in the UK, it goes the default backup withholding rate is 28. The UK citizens get reduced to 17%. So you need to make sure that you're looking up all of the information on that individual and understand how the backup withholding rules vary based on the treaty rates, in addition to the fact that the individual is not a U.S. citizen and you have paperwork to prove that. Now, California has done something interesting. California requires non-residents of California who have California-sourced income, who are subject to withholding, that those individuals are withheld upon for the state of California. So in that case, it's the one condition where we actually have non-residents for California-sourced income who are being taxed on California payments and who would otherwise not be filing a California income tax return. This is one of those things that people are most frequently used to seeing as rules for entertainers or sports figures, where if I actually am, if I'm at an NFL team and I play 4 games a season in the state of California, then the number of games I played for the whole year, so 16 games, 4 games a season. So 1/4 of my income would be California sourced income under those rules. So I would actually have to pay income tax on 1/4 of my income as a football player because I played in California 4 times that year. And entertainers work the same way. So Convey's in Minnesota. Al Franken got in trouble for not reporting his income for the comedy shows that he was doing nationwide, and part of it was because he ran afoul of this rule. So when you're dealing with California-sourced income, remember it's California's rules determine whether or not that's from there. If you got paid for services in California, you're subject to California withholding in that case.
One last question. What if I overpaid my withholding?
Yeah, so people regularly say, I withheld too much money or I overpaid withholding. Can I give that money back to my customer or my vendor? And the answer is no, if it's already out the door to the agency. Once the regulatory agency has those funds, your only option would be to, normally would be to tell the taxpayer to go and file with that agency to collect it. Because that money was given to that regulatory agency in their name. So you're saying, Jane Smith performed 1,000 hours of services for me at $50 an hour, so here's $50,000 payment to Jane Smith, but I withheld on her, so $15,000 went to the federal government. Well, if Jane Smith if you're able to verify that Jane Smith in fact wasn't subject to withholding, but you did it anyway, Jane has to go back and collect that money. You can't get it back on her behalf. So again, I guess the short answer is the best answer to backup withholding is to not have to do backup withholding.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jeff. We have recorded everyone's questions, and we apologize if we didn't get a chance to get to yours. We will be following up with you to hopefully get an answer to your question as soon as possible. And again, with that, that concludes our webinar today. And on the screen, you'll see a couple of links or resources or additional resources for Convey. If you'd like some more information on any of our solutions that can help to streamline your backup withholding process and help you stay in compliance, please visit us at convey.com, or again, call us at 1-888-303-1099. And with that, we are concluded for today, and have a great rest of your afternoon.